Hello, recognise the hat? I'm Malcolm, the Folk East wandering sketch artist, but I'm not at Glenham Hall. I'm here in my very hot studio today. I'm really going to miss being at the festival this year, so I thought I'd like to make a little video about some of my top tips for drawing. These are some of the things I do when I'm out and about with my pencils and drawing book at Folk East. I love all the music and the jackalope and the very interesting things there are to see all over the festival site, but most of all, I love to watch people and try to catch them unawares while I'm drawing. This means that people are not posing for my pictures, and I have to sketch them quickly, leaving most of the details for later if there's time. So, here are my 5 top tips for sketching people. You don't need any special materials. Just a pencil and some paper or a sketchbook is all you require. Number 1. Most people are around 7 heads tall. Knowing this will help you with getting the proportions right. If the head looks too big, the arms too short or the legs too long, check how many heads there are in each bit of your drawing. Here's a hint. Arms are usually longer than you think, legs are usually shorter than you think, and if your subject's sitting down, there are around 4 heads to the bottom of their bottom. Okay, here's a very quick sketch of somebody who's sort of standing up. It's just anybody, it's not a real person. So if their head is that sort of size, roughly about 7 of those lengths go into most people's bodies. If they're really tall, it might be 7.5. Okay, if they're Superman, then it would be 8. Okay, so head is that sort of shape. There we go. Shoulders up here. Now, next head down is around the middle of their chest. The next head down is roughly where their belly button is. The next one is sort of at the bottom of their bottom, and then there's legs. Now, it's worth noticing that the people, most ordinary sized people, not supermodels or ballet dancers, their bottom is further than halfway down from the top of their head to the bottom of their feet. We tend to want to draw people with little heads, quite short bodies and really long legs. In fact, people's bottoms are lower down than you think they are. So we've got a chest here, belly button here, bottom of their bottom, so that's from behind, there, and then their legs are the sort of rest of them. And legs start from higher up, don't they, where we call our hips. They're actually higher up, they're somewhere in between the bottom and the belly button. So they're up here, so legs look longer than they really are. And feet down at the bottom here somewhere. So I'll just put in a couple of feet here, and there we go. So when I say that most people are about 7 heads, that's 1 head. So 1 down to there, 2 down to there, which is about the middle of their chest. I think if you know anything about how bodies are built, there's a rib cage in here, and then the shoulders come out here, and the arms, and I'll talk about the arms in just a minute. So number 2, head, is down to here. Number 3, head, is down to the belly button. Number 4, head, is about where the bottom of their bottom is, and then we carry on down. There's about another 3 or 3.5 heads worth until we get down to the floor. Now, when it comes to arms, it's worth noting that the tips of our fingers, when we're standing up really straight, end up quite low down, lower than our bottoms. So our hands are here, standing to attention here, and arms are here. So most people's arms are longer than we think they are. Their elbows, a lot of people draw elbows so they're quite high up. In fact, if those arms are reaching right down, they're almost touching the middle of your thigh down here. Knees are around 2 heads up from the floor, so we sort of count upwards sometimes for heads, and the top of your hips is usually about 4 heads up from the bottom of the feet. So there we go. So when I say that most people are 7 heads high, that's really what I mean. About 7 of their head shapes fit into the whole length of their body. Now, of course, if they're sitting down, let's sit this person down. So don't forget, knees are about here. So if this is the floor, and their knees are here, and their feet are here. So I'm going to sit them down facing this way now. So knees are up here. So if that's their bottom here, the bottom of their thigh, and there's a leg here. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So their head, somewhere like this. Elbows usually line up, by the way, your elbows usually line up with your belly button. Try it out. So their elbow is going to be about here somewhere from the shoulder, and the rest of their hands are going to be like this. But this shape here, if that's one head, we've got another 3 of them. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Take us down to where the bottom of where they're sitting is the bottom of their bottom. Okay. Number 2. You can fill in the details of clothes even after they've moved. So it's more important to catch their overall shape than to worry about what colour their socks are or the distance between their eyebrows. I get to draw lots of musicians at Folk East. Here's a good case. And people think it's really hard to draw musicians, but actually, when they're in the middle of playing, they mostly stand or sit quite still. Now, their arms might move, or they might nod their head, but their basic body shape is going to stay pretty much the same. But even though this pipe player from the Gold Star Morris team, part of the band, was stood still probably for the whole of a dance, which might have lasted 3 or 4 minutes, that still was not very long to get a big sketch in. So all of the details of the clothing that make him certainly part of the Gold Star team, for example, the Gold Star, the sashes, the way that the handkerchiefs are hung on the belt, the bells on the shins and the big boots that they wear, details like that were all things that I could add after he'd finished playing while he was standing watching some other team dance. So I would have got his basic stance, so get his head in place. Very important because of the way he was standing, was his elbows were tucked in while he's playing his whistle, which is here. Okay, his head was tipped down very slightly, so it makes his eyes look very low, and I can see quite a lot of his hair. His elbows tucked into his body like this, and standing. And if you look, if I drop a plumb line down here, you'll see, whoops, right down between his feet, which means he's standing very steady. His feet slightly turned out like this. So that's the important information. And here, look at that, you think of where his bottom is, that's about 4 heads down. He was quite tall, so his legs are a little bit longer, but he's still not much more than about 3.5, as well as his 4, 1, 2, 3. So he's still about 7 heads high. So that's what I would have got in while he was playing. Basic shape, how tall he was, how big his legs looked, etc., etc. And then after he moved away and was watching somebody else, I could then look at the details of his costume and say, oh, well, actually, he's got a sash that runs over both shoulders and hangs down at both hips. He's got a star in this big roundel in the centre here. His breeches were stopped off at the knee here with elastics or with bows. I think they were bows, probably. There were scarves, handkerchiefs tied into his, and ribbons tied into his belt. And he had big sort of shin pads that were covered in jingling bells. So all of that information I could get, not when he was playing, but while he was standing around talking to somebody else watching another team. So get the important stuff in first. That will give you your proportions and your overall stance. All the other details can be filled in later. Number 3. Let your eyes take in the whole person by looking them up and down and side to side from the very beginning. If you're really short on time, check the position of their head, hands and feet. You can add more later. Are they leaning forward or backward? Are they standing mostly on one leg? Ask yourself where a straight line drawn down from the end of their nose would end up. Would it be between their feet or more over one than the other? Here's a drawing I did last year at Folk East of 2 dancers on one of the ceilidhs. Now, as you can imagine, they were not standing still and they were not in one single position for any longer than a few seconds. So I watched them quite a long time until I decided that they kept doing the same thing that was repeating, and I thought it would make a really nice sketch. So, the order in which I drew them, if I cover this drawing up with a little bit of tracing paper, I can show you. The first thing I needed to notice is whereabouts their heads were going to go, so I drew the heads in. And I knew the floor was down here somewhere, and I wanted to give the impression that they were sort of very lightly on the floor, so I chose a moment when their feet were hardly touching the ground at all. In fact, this one's actually off the floor, isn't it, there? So I got their head, and I spent the time, allowed my eyes to travel up and down in both directions, from top of the head to the bottom of the tips of their toes, and from side to side across as well, so I could get an idea of how wide they were when they were really stretched out. Now, they were holding hands at that point, so this woman's hands come to here and this woman's hands come to here somewhere, so I couldn't draw the details of their fingers, but I let my eyes go up and down the page or up and down the scene, getting a sense of where their feet were in relation to the floor, and as long as I could get their hands in place, the rest of it almost doesn't matter. I know that they're about 7 heads high. We've already looked at that. And so I know that somewhere around her belly button is going to be a couple of heads down. So that's about right. Her bottom's going to be here somewhere. So that means that her dress is going, although it's flapping about because she's dancing really energetically, it's going to be somewhere down here around where her knees were. So as long as I've got these things in place first, all the rest of it I can fill in by looking at her later. I can look at her when she's standing somewhere else. Same with this one. Now, her head was here. I want, again, this foot's completely off the ground here. This one is just on the ground, and it's a bit spread at the bottom because her toes are, if I was to draw her toes in, they're sort of just taking her weight, but her ankle's off the floor. And again, her hands, I'm looking at slightly sideways, so this hand is sticking out a little bit to the side. Her arms don't look quite so wide, because I'm seeing her slightly sideways. And once again, somewhere down here, I knew that was where her bottom was going to be, because that's about 4 heads worth. Her knees are a couple of heads up from the ground. And as long as I've got the general shape of the skirt, I can fill in these details. I could look at her later. She might be standing talking to her friends later on, and then I can start to fill in and notice whether there was a belt on her dress, or whether there were some frills around the bottom, or whether there was a zip at the front, or some buttons or things like that. I don't need to draw them straight away at the time. I also made a little note here that their hair, because they both had quite long hair, was flying about in the breeze as well while they were dancing. So it's not impossible to draw people that are moving, as long as you get some interesting information down first. And in my case, it's always going to be head, hands and feet. And if I can get those in place, I've got the good basis for a drawing. Another thing that's really helpful when I'm drawing people, especially if they're moving, is to imagine that they've got a little bit of blue tack on the end of their nose, and a nice piece of string with a little weight on the end is hanging right down from the end of it and going to the floor. So that if they do that, I can see where is their head in relation to their feet, and that gives me a sense of that this person is sort of fairly up in the air, but they're balanced, aren't they, because their weight is going down into the floor between both feet, whereas this woman here is leaning forward, and because she's leaning forward, that little plumb line dropped from the end of her nose would be going right down the floor here in front of this foot. Everything else is behind. In fact, if she was to stop still and she was to let go, she'd probably fall over. But in fact, because they're dancing, they're going to move into another position soon. So another little way of checking is just to have a look at where that imaginary line would go if I dropped it down from the end of their nose. Number 4. Heads are not lollipops. What I mean is that our necks come out of the back of our heads, not from underneath. Unless your subject's a ballet dancer, most necks are quite short, and we can't really see them much from the front or back. From the side, heads are definitely in front of the shoulders, and the neck is at an angle. A common mistake that people make when they're drawing is that they think that heads sit on top of necks, which sit on top of shoulders. Makes the head look a little bit like a lollipop. So that's really not the best way to draw them. This is a bit more accurate. A face looking at you like this, the shoulders are often a lot higher up, and that's because if you look at the face from the side here, so this is a side view, same man looking at us from the side, our necks don't come out from the bottom of our heads, they come out from the back of our heads here at this angle and come into the shoulders like so. So the front of the body is like this, and then we've got shoulders up here, arms, etc., depending on how they're standing. But it just means that when you look from the front like this, so I'm looking from the front, the chin is often at the same height as the shoulder blades like this. Some people, especially when they get old or if they're a little infirm, in fact their heads drop even further, so that they're really quite slumped in front of them, and what happens is the whole of the body sort of sags a little bit and makes a kind of S shape like this. And what happens is their shoulders go back, their tummies come out, and their thighs are further forward, and they have the weight on the backs of their feet like so. So they form a kind of sort of sinewy sort of S shape like this as they get older. Finally, number 5. It's better to start again if you think you've gone wrong. Don't worry about rubbing things out. That can be a waste of valuable time. Next time, use the wrong marks to help you make the right ones before you rub out. Let's imagine I've started to draw somebody and I start to think, well, their head's tipped forward just a little bit. And then I start to draw them and I start thinking about their eyes and I think, well, hang on a minute, that's not quite right. I've got the eyes in the wrong place. They're a bit too high up to make it look as if they're looking down. So instead of getting my rubber and rubbing the eyes out like this and then having another go and trying to get it right, and oh, it's still not quite right. Well, if I know that something doesn't look quite right, then I might know how it would look a bit better. And I still think they should go a little bit lower than that. So I'm going to leave the wrong marks in place, just check against something that I know should be there. So I think the eyes should be lower down even further. And I think the nose comes down here like this. So I get the eyes in, I use the wrong marks to help me guide my pencil to the right place. And then if I need to and I've got time, I can get rid of the wrong marks. But that way I'm probably going to get to where I need to go a little bit faster. I hope you find these tips useful. There's nothing I like better than drawing with a pencil and paper. I always seem to see so much more of everything when I'm drawing it. You will too. But don't worry about doing a masterpiece every time you get out a pencil. Practice little and often, and don't worry if it doesn't seem quite right. The more you practice, the better you'll get each time. I'm not always good with every drawing. Loads of my drawings are rubbish. The secret is, of course, that I only show you the good ones. Have a lovely virtual Folk East. I look forward to seeing you again at Glenham Hall in 2021. Oh, and do make sure you bring a pencil with you. Bye for now.